All right, I think I got the signal that we could start. Good afternoon. My name is Shusha Chen. I am an art historian and curator specializing in Chinese photography. I'm currently a visiting scholar at Australian Centre on China in the World, ANU, and a curator of Sydney University's Chow Chow Bing Museum. Thank you, CIW, for organizing such an amazing conference, remembering Taiwan's martial law and the wayfaring photography in 1970s and 80s Taiwan, which I co-created with Dr. Olivia Krischer. It is with great pleasure to welcome Professor Guo Lixing to deliver this lecture on rethinking modernist and realist photography in 1970s Taiwan as a keynote for both the conference and the exhibition. Before we start, I would like to acknowledge that the conference and exhibition are being held on the traditional country of the Ngunnawal peoples, and I am speaking from unceded Wango land in Eora Nation, Sydney. I pay my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging, and extend this recognition and respect to all First Nations people, including especially all any First Nations people of Taiwan as well. Professor Guo Lixing is a critic of photography and documentary film in Taiwan. He received his PhD from Goldsmiths College, University of London, and is currently professor and dean at the College of Communication, National Zhengzi University, Taiwan. His recent publications in Chinese, including more writings on photography, in interrogating reality, politics, and the politicization of documentary film, and most recently, manufacturing meaning, discourse, power, and cultural politics in realist photography. Olivia and I have been greatly informed and inspired by Professor Guo's writings on Taiwanese photography and documentary film, particularly during our research for the Wayfaring exhibition. Thank you, Professor Guo, for joining us today out of your really busy schedule from Taipei. Before passing this over to you, as we all are really familiar with the format of Zoom webinar now, please submit any questions through Q&A function throughout the lecture, and I will moderate the Q&A afterwards. Without any delay, let's welcome Professor Guo. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shusha, for your kind introduction. And I really want to pay my gratitude to Dr. Chen Shusha and Dr. Olivia Krischer, co-curators of Wayfaring exhibition, photo exhibition, for inviting me to this occasion. I feel very much privileged to give this online talk on the opening day of the exhibition, though I wish I could do this in front of you in person instead, okay, and be able to see the exhibition myself. Okay, the topic today is rethinking modernist and realist photography in 1970s Taiwan. And I want to first point out that modernist and realist photography were two major approaches of photographic practices in 1970s Taiwan, which marked some of the outstanding achievements of the Taiwanese art community of that decade. These approaches appeared in the 1960s and continued to be popular after the 1980s, especially realist photography. By rethinking these two sets of key concepts in this talk, I'd like to emphasize that they are imported foreign concepts, just like photography itself. So we cannot automatically grasp the meaning of these terms as they are understood in the Western context, where photography was invented and has been practiced for over 180 years. Actually, for people like me from the non-Western world, it is in a certain sense my post-colonial burden, if you like, to always scrutinize and re-examine the meanings and context of various cultural affairs when they are imported from and influenced by the West. We have to be more conscious and self-reflexive of cultural matters that involve issues such as identity or cultural subjectivity. So before I analyze how these two terms could be understood in 1970s Taiwan, let me just very briefly review their relevant context in the West, as well as the specific socio-political milieu of Taiwan at that time. I'm sure though, most or perhaps all of you are already familiar with the related knowledge. For photographic modernism, it was an artistic approach and movement in Western art and photography history, appearing roughly from the beginning of the 20th century. This art movement was rooted in and developed from the industrialized, modernized societies of Western Europe and North America. What we see in many modernist photographic works is a reflection or response to rationalization, urbanization, and other such experiences or phenomena in modern Western societies. As for the notion of photographic realism, its history is longer still. One might trace its advent almost to around the same time photography was invented, in the mid-19th century. Excuse me. That is also the time positivism became a dominant theory in Western sociology. I want to note that this is an important fact to remember. That is, sociological positivism needed photography's help as a very convincing tool to support scientific studies with visible, therefore reliable evidence. In other words, positivism is at the core of realism in Western photographic practices, no matter if it is applied in photojournalism, documentary photography, as a sociological or anthropological research methods, or as undeniable evidence in medical diagnosis, police investigations, or in court. I think Michel Foucault talked about this already in very clear and critical way. We in Taiwan have a very different history, however, in terms of social cultural progress and the development of photography. As you know very well, up to almost the end of the 19th century, Taiwan remained a largely pre-modern agricultural society. There were some photographs produced, but they were all made either by Western missionaries and travelers or by Japanese colonizers and their anthropologists. The Japanese colonizers, in their 50-year governance of Taiwan, from 1895 to 1945, brought to this island a certain transplanted second-hand colonial modernity by building infrastructure as well as educational, medical, and legal systems. But Taiwanese people of the colonial era were discouraged or forbidden from developing their intellectual capacities. From around the 1920s, there were a few talented local photographers who could afford expensive photographic equipment, but it was not yet possible for them to advocate for or establish their own artistic propositions in photography. When the Nationalist Party, or the KMT, took over all the infrastructure left by the colonizers and continued its governance in Taiwan from 1949, they did not do much at all for this society until the 1970s, except reinforcing strict political and thought control. As the KMT applied martial law to legitimize its regime, to a considerable degree, society remained agricultural and pre-modern. People's vision of the world beyond this island were very limited. And in some senses, society stagnated and became ill-informed. Then we came to the critical decade of the 1970s. On the one hand, the KMT regime was confronted with diplomatic defeats. On the other hand, Taiwan's economy began to grow, and younger generations at that time could receive better education. Together with other factors, the 1970s became an interesting decade for Taiwan in the sense that the intellectual activities were gradually loosening up, and some cultural and artistic explorations became possible, although freedom of expression has still not arrived. In light of this brief review above, I'd like to argue that both photographic approaches of modernism and realism are outcomes of the era of serious political repression in Taiwan under martial law. This era began in the 1950s and continued through 1970s till 1987, when martial law was finally lifted. For some of the most brilliant modernist photographers at that time, such as Zhang Zhaotang and Xie Chunde, I suggest their representative works categorized with this approach could be understood as a means of escape, resistance, or self-salvation from the suffocating political atmosphere. Their photographs were not really representations or interpretations of a highly industrial, urbanized, or rationalized society, but rather their personal cry with artistic expressions, longing for free air. Now let me show some of the examples of their works to elaborate this point. Okay, let's see two of the representative modernist photographers, Zhang Zhaotang and Xie Chunde's work. First of all, Zhang Zhaotang. Well, and let me just quickly introduce their backgrounds and their works according to my interpretation. This is Zhang Zhaotang's early works in 1960s. And Zhang Zhaotang was born in Banqiao in 1943. Banqiao is a rural area at that time in Taipei County. Now it's called New Taipei City. And he was graduated from National Taiwan University, which is the best university in Taiwan, from Department of Civil Engineering. But he was actually interested in arts and literature, not engineering. And many of his friends during his college years were studying at National Taiwan College of Arts. Okay, that's a professional college at Banqiao. Some of the most famous Taiwanese filmmakers were graduates from there during that time, like Li An or Hou Xiaoxian. Now, you can see Zhang's early work with lots of headless figures, or sometimes we saw people suffocated, putting on a plastic bag when riding a bicycle in the rain, or this kind of peculiar images with a person behind the mosquito net curtain, or a staged theatricalized arrangements of scenes and his actors. This is one of his good friends, actually. Also, the shot was taken in Banqiao area, or some dead animal looking like a cat, or I don't really know what particular animal is that. Or some blurring faces. This is Zhang Daotang's, one of his self-portraits. Okay. And well, we may as well just see Xie Chunde's at the same time. Oh, oops, sorry. Xie Chunde is a very productive photographer, artist. He was born in 1949 in Taichung to a farmer's family. And he didn't receive much institutionalized education, but he went to do a lot of various work, labor work, all kinds, factory workers, and so on. And he was a self-taught artist, very talented one. And at his 19th years, he held his first solo photography exhibition with modernist and staged images. And these were some of the works selected from that first solo exhibition. This one, he titled each works, like this one is called Stretching Towards the Sky. We see airplane landing Taipei Songshan Airport, and we see some of this very old apartment buildings, fly floor buildings, in a very desolate background. The whole scenery is kind of isolated or desolated, or like this one, kind of isolated. Young woman standing below a flyover. The title of this work is Flyover. And with slightly blurring image. Oops. Okay, and the next one is titled Moonlight. Okay, with a half nude female figure and an airplane flying over. This image is titled Tears on Danshui River. Okay. Danshui River is the major river that flows through Taipei City to the sea. Okay. And this one is called Love at the Monument. Okay. This image always reminded me of Roy Andersson, the Swedish filmmaker's famous film works. Very bold experiment and arrangement from Xie Chunde. Okay, Xie Chunde's, Zhang Daotang's works, we see a lot of metaphorical visual expressions. Okay, implications of loss of self, loss of identity, hopelessness, or even meaningless life under 1960s political atmosphere, right? And Xie Chunde's works even bolder in a way that he expresses this desolate landscape, sexual repression, and sexual liberation as a resistance for me of social or political repression, or provocative sexuality as a very courageous posture against the then very repressive atmosphere. Okay, Zhang Daotang said his early photographic works were productions out of boredom, nihilism, and discontent from living in a repressive conservative age. Some of his most famous images were made in the 1960s, and the visual style of absurdity or theatricality remain as a very distinctive characteristics in Zhang's photographs in 1970s onwards. And Zhang Zhaotang applied such an artistic approach or imagination with what he absorbed and borrowed from Western literature, theater, and folk music. Those were the major sources of nourishment that heavily influenced the young man's mind and his art, rather than his direct experiences or observations in a modern urban society. In an interview from a new book, Photologs 3, just published this month, Xie Chunde recalling his first solo exhibition in 1969, as we saw some of the works just now, had also said, he said that, quote, we did not have a clear context or history like Western art. At best, we just cut out or imitated bits and pieces from them and put it into our own works. But it was not rooted in our culture and was very fragile, unquote. In fact, both Xie Chunde and Zhang Zhaotang also made a lot of realist photography with a humanist touch in the 1970s. Xie Chunde in particular had experimented with a good variety of visual methods or styles in his long career as a photographic artist. And a modernist approach was just one of those he tried during that time. As for understanding the practice of photographic realism in some pioneers' works in the 1970s, I propose that they were far from taking a positivist perspective when producing such images. Let us again see some examples of works, selected works of Wang Xin and Ruan Yizhong. These are a few images from Wang Xin's Farewell Orchid Island, his classic reportage, photographs in 1975. Now, Wang Xin was born in 1942. She studied animal husbandry and veterinary at Pingdong, her hometown, Pingdong's agricultural college, a professional college. And later on, she went to Tokyo and studied the same fields at Tokyo's University of Agriculture. But just like Zhang Zhaotang, her real love is photography, and she finally graduated from Tokyo Professional Photography School. She admired W. Eugene Smith, the famous documentary photographer in 20th century in the States. And Wang Xin is first female documentary photographer in Taiwan. She, during, as I just said, 1974 to 1975, she uses 2 summer vacations to Lanyu, or Orchid Island, to document Dao people, one of the indigenous people in Taiwan. And this was one of the earliest documentary project, a serious one. And Wang Xin also photographs some other places in Taiwan with many very classic images. And we see in this project, Farewell Orchid Island, Wang Xin took I would call quasi-anthropological style with a romantic or romanticized approach to document the daily life of Dao people. Wang did record some of the realities they were confronting with goodwill, but most of the images in this series, for me, she took a humanitarian stand. Some of them actually quite sentimental. And let's see Ran Yizhong, and another very famous figure, perhaps the most famous one as realist photographers in Taiwan. Sorry, this is still Wang Xin's. I didn't finish showing Wang Xin's works, I'm sorry. You see the traditional outfit for Dao's men and Dao kids gathering in front of a TV set, watching this modern information from Taiwan, main island. Okay, that's Wang Xin's Farewell Oki Island. And for Ran Yizhong's work, okay, let me again briefly introduce Ran Yizhong. The photographer was born in 1950s in Yilan, a county northwest of Taiwan, coastal area. And he was also born to a farmer's family. And he came to Taipei at teenage years. With his own word, he tried to escape poverty and hardship, laboring work in the farms, because he wanted very much to be an artist. And he worked very hard as art workers at magazines and newspapers during his younger years. He became very active photographer since mid-1970s to 1980s and onwards. Ran Yizhong established photography classes and darkroom technique classes. He published photo magazines and books, his own books as well as other photographers' books. He became the most famous Taiwanese figure in photography on both sides of the channels, particularly in mainland China. Now, these works were selected from his famous monograph published in 1987 called Man and Land. As you can see, his compositions were always precise and sharp. And his sort of decisive moment photographs with this rural scenes, old man bathing in a stream and buffalo behind, kids playing, crossing the trench, and his famous shots for Man and Land, kids playing. Okay, now we see Wang Xin and Ran Yizhong's work. Ran Yizhong's famous Man and Land is a project also started in mid-1970s. One can see plenty of images of rural people and their lifestyle, captured with eye-catching compositions or decisive moment, as we just saw. Perhaps these were examples of humanist photography in a certain sense, but they have little to do with a positivist method or intention. As I mentioned earlier, in the 1970s, the KMT government was facing an increasingly uncertain situation internationally or domestically. People were fed up with Chiang Kai-shek's delusions or fabrications about taking back mainland China and began to express a desire for truth and local knowledge, largely influenced by this political climate, and in particular by campaigns such as the Native Literature Movement in the second half of the 1970s. Photographers like Wang Xin and Ran Yizhong deployed photography to help viewers return into the rural and ordinary people's lives. Realist photography in this period was valuable in that it brought Taiwanese photography to a fresh start, escaping from the propagandistic, brainwashing government images, or from so-called salon photography, that is, an amateur photographic exercise of techniques or pictorialism. Both of government images or salon photography made realities invisible. Nonetheless, these realist photographs were not yet an investigative method to expose harsh realities, nor dig out truth from political lies. They were more of an effective medium rather than a cold scientific instrument. My analysis of the above-mentioned photographers does not mean to take away the fact that they are all brilliant artists and they have contributed to Taiwanese photographic legacy one way or another. I simply try to suggest a more scrupulous, instead of taken for granted, understanding of certain terms or concepts when we talk about photographic practices in 1970s Taiwan. That's all for my talk. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Kuo, for such an insightful and informative lecture on these two main photographic practices in 1970s Taiwan, mainly modernist and realist photography. These four photographers you mentioned and some of the works from the same series that you mentioned will be exhibited in the Wayfaring exhibition. So it would be so great that you could be at Canberra to see the exhibition. Well, you know, that's the reality of the pandemic world, but it's so wonderful that also for our audience who could attend the exhibition have some some insight from you already before the opening.